Yesterday we did, I did a little presentation on Serling's career, focusing on the Twilight Zone and what he was dealing with in terms of television at the time that the Twilight Zone first came on the air. And today we're just gonna kind of freeform this about the Twilight Zone specifically, or really anything you want to ask me about Rod Serling. So I'll just start by just telling you a little bit about the work I did to research the book. It took me about 4 years of research and writing to put the book together. It's the first book that actually covers Rod Serling's entire career, straight from the beginning all the way through the end. So it's in and out of the Twilight Zone. We've had a dozen books about the Twilight Zone, some of them very good. We had one really good Night Gallery book that came out, but no book has actually covered the entirety of his career before, at least in this manner, in a show-by-show way. So this goes through every series that he worked on from 1950 to 1975. So Playhouse 90 is detailed in here, Twilight Zone, Night Gallery, all these shows in the golden age of television, Kraft Theater, the Ford Theater, Lux Video Theater, all of those shows are detailed in here. Some shows maybe you've never heard of, like The Loner and The New People, are in here. Dedicated chapter to Planet of the Apes. He co-wrote the original Planet of the Apes. So I talk about that in here. And again, absolutely everything that he did. So now the Twilight Zone, Twilight Zone ran from 1959 to 1964, 5 seasons of 156 episodes. Rod Serling died in 1975, 50 years old. He died during open heart surgery. He essentially died on the table. And his career basically began in 1950. So his career ran essentially from 1950 to 1975. You have 25 years. And it's remarkable how the Twilight Zone is really almost exactly the center of that career. It's the middle ground of his career. He basically had 10 years before the Twilight Zone, 5 years of the Twilight Zone, and then 10 years after the Twilight Zone. So, and coincidentally, in the book, the Twilight Zone is almost the exact center of this book, and I didn't, do that on purpose, but it just came out that way because I do cover absolutely everything, and that's the way it worked out. So, so Rod Serling, he wrote a lot of science fiction early in his career, believe it or not. People don't realize exactly how much Rod Serling loved science fiction, loved fantasy, loved science fiction, and when he had the freedom to write that kind of story, he did it. And in 1951, 1952, he wrote a lot of science fiction for a series called The Storm, which was a series that was shown only in Cincinnati. It was performed and broadcast live in Cincinnati on WKRC, not KRP, but KRC Cincinnati. And he wrote, he ventured into the realm of Twilight Zone-esque stories on that series. Now, unfortunately, this show was performed live, and they were not filmed, so they're gone. They have been lost to time. There are a couple of examples of the show that still exist. One episode was filmed, and that one you can Google around. You might be able to find it on the black market, so to speak. It's called No Gods to Serve, and it's actually very good. There was another episode that was filmed late after the show ended, but it was a script that he wrote for the series, and that was filmed as a pilot for another series that didn't sell. That one exists, but that one you're not going to find. I don't have that one. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
What do you mean by live? I'm sorry, I don't understand that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I should back up a little bit. Yeah, if you don't know, but in the early days of television, 1950 to 1958, most shows were performed live, just like a Broadway show. They were performed live and they were broadcast live to the audience. So unless you used what was called the kinescope process. The kinescope process was a process where they would actually set up a movie camera and aim it at a monitor that was showing the performance, and they would basically film the monitor of the performance, and so that was the only way to capture this performance on film. So what would happen is they actually would do that. They would do it very often anyway. They would kinescope the show, and then they would actually send it to the east to the west coast. They would, physically mail it, and that's how they would show the show on the west coast, because it was live here on the east coast, and they would send it out to the west coast, and they would play the kinescope. And usually what happened after that is they would throw it out. Unless they had some kind of use for it, they would throw it out or they would record over it. So they were lost a lot of them.
I thought Rod Serling kept every version of every script that he had to do it. So therefore, can't we have just get the scripts of these things?
Yeah, actually, Serling had, there are several major archives of Serling material across the country. The main one is in Wisconsin. the Madison, Wisconsin State Historical Society. And they have like 80 boxes of scripts and correspondence and contracts and miscellanea and et cetera, et cetera. It's a treasure trove of stuff. So almost every script he wrote up till a certain point is there. But then there are also archives at UCLA, California obviously, and Ithaca College where he taught for a while. So there were scripts there also. But for whatever reason, those stories, those scripts for the Storm specifically, very few of them are in those archives. Those even the scripts have been lost, a lot of them, which was a shame. There are a few of them that are still there. I was able to get, but I was able to piece together, the stories of those scripts, most of them. So this will be the first time actually that anybody's going to be able to even give you a list of what he wrote for the Storm, those stories, and I synopsized as many of them as I could in the book. So those stories are gone, but a couple of them have real explicit connections to the Twilight Zone. One was called The Pitch. And this episode actually morphed in, he rewrote it into One for the Angels, the first season Twilight Zone episode. You might remember with Ed Wynn, he's a sidewalk salesman, and he has to give the pitch for the angels to save a little girl from death coming together. Well, that was originally done on the Storm as The Pitch. It was significantly different. It didn't have a supernatural aspect to it. But it was the same idea of this sidewalk salesman who had to give a big pitch for a particular reason. It's a slightly different story. But so there was that one, and then the other one that has explicit connection to the Twilight Zone was the time element. I talked a little about the time element yesterday, but the time element. Yeah, today it's considered the unofficial pilot to the Twilight Zone, the time element. The reason for that is to get back to the beginning, he did write it for the Storm originally in 1951, and it was a half-hour long, and it was performed on the Storm live again, and it was lost forever. Then he did it as a radio script in 1954 on a series that he produced called It Happens to You. So it was done on radio, and then when he had this chance to do the Twilight Zone, he always really liked this story, the time element. Again, if you weren't there yesterday, the time element is about a man who believes he's been traveling back in time to the days before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And he's trying to warn everybody that this attack is coming on Pearl Harbor. Of course, nobody believes him. And the story is about how he goes to a psychiatrist and he says, I'm having this dream, but I don't think it's a dream. I think I'm really going back in time to Pearl Harbor. And at the end of the story, he falls asleep on the psychiatrist's couch. He yet again goes back to Pearl Harbor, and he's again warning everybody, and nobody's listening to him. And the planes are coming in, and that's it. And the psychiatrist is then left with just kind of a vague recollection of having treated this guy. He doesn't know. He just kind of vaguely remembers him, and he goes to a bar and he sees a picture of this guy on the wall, and it looks familiar. And he asks the bartender, "Hey, who's that?" And he says, "Well, it's Pete Jensen." And the name sounds familiar. He says, "Oh, well, what happened to him?" He says, "Oh, well, he died at Pearl Harbor." So it was a very Twilight Zone-esque ending. It was very ambiguous and open-ended what actually happened to it, and that was originally done on the Storm, with essentially the same ending.
I just wanted to make a comment that he used a similar story with Russell Johnson going back to prevent the Lincoln assassination.
Yeah,
pretty much that story.
Yeah, and the same kind of idea that he wasn't going to be able to prevent it.
Right.
Yeah, but he was going to go back and try.
Some things you can change, some you can't.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, certainly it's what love time travel, that idea. But to get back to your point though, so then when he was able to pitch the Twilight Zone, 1958, he was able to do what he wanted to do. He went back and got that story, he expanded it to an hour, and he submitted to CBS as Twilight Zone: The Time Element. He explicitly named it Twilight Zone. That was the name of the series that he wanted to do. And he submitted it, and they rejected it. They still wanted to work with Serling. They wanted him to do a series, but they didn't like that as a pilot because of that open ending, and ambiguous ending, and they thought the audience would be confused by it. So what happened was Desilu Playhouse bought it, and they aired it. So it aired on Desilu Playhouse, not as the Twilight Zone, but as a script for Desilu Playhouse. And since it's been released on Twilight Zone DVD collections and stuff, so now it's considered the unofficial pilot of the Twilight Zone, because it really was intended to be the pilot.
Didn't Desi come out and try to explain?
Yeah,
it?
yes. Yeah, and that's I mentioned that yesterday. At the end of the ending was, you know, they feared it would be so confusing that Desi Arnaz actually came out at the end of the show and basically explained it to the
In
audience.
his Cuban
which was
accent.
yeah, yeah. And you know, and Desi Arnaz, I get into this in the book actually. Desi Arnaz, believe it or not, is one of the kind of the unsung heroes of the Twilight Zone history, because he fought for that script. He wanted that on Desi would play house. He loved it. He loved Serling, as pretty much everybody did at the time. And he really wanted to do it, and so you know, without him, and you know, who knows what would have happened? He's kind of he was a really key figure in it. And you know, the funny thing is, his daughter Lucy Arnaz, you know, Desi and Lucy's daughter Lucy Arnaz, she said that, you know, she became a huge fan. She was a huge fan of the show, and she would watch it with her father constantly. They watched it a million times. She said you know, when after Lucy and Desi were divorced, she would spend summers with her father or weekends, and he would watch Twilight Zone all the time. And she said never once did he ever say, hey, you know, if it wasn't for me, you know, he never took credit. She didn't know the connection until decades later, that there was a connection between him and the show. So, but yeah. So as far as Twilight Zone-esque stories and science fiction and fantasy, that Rod Serling, he loved to do it. But of course, when he broke into television, it just wasn't done. You know, science fiction was not being done on television, at least not in an adult, intelligent way. So he did, you know, what everybody else did. He did straight drama, and he was very, very good at it. And he, you know, won a whole bunch of awards, and he got, you know, he built a name for himself and a reputation for himself as the angry young man of television. That was the nickname he ended up getting, because he would fight the sponsors and the network censors over this idea of trying to address social issues in television, and you know, in straight drama. And when it came time for him to do that show that he wanted to do, he said, I'll do it in science fiction, and maybe I can get away with some of these ideas that I've been trying to post in regular drama. I can get them by if I do it in a science fiction or fantasy context. And it worked. You know, it certainly worked. Yeah.
We went to school with my father's sister. My father's sister.
Oh, terrific. You went to high school with him?
My father went to school with he went to school with my parents.
That's great. That's great, yeah. He graduated in January of '42, and the day after high school graduation, he went off to the Army. He volunteered for the Army the day after high school graduation. He was, like a lot of people, he was pumped up about, you know, getting back at some people for Pearl Harbor, and he was born into a Jewish family, and he wanted to go get the Nazis, and he was a patriotic guy, and he wanted to serve. And he did. He had this idea that he wanted to be a paratrooper. He, you know, he's 5 feet 4 inches tall. When he joined the Army, he was 118 pounds, and he was barely 18 years old. He was born on Christmas Day, so he graduated. Back in those days, I guess they had a split session, whatever, because he graduated in January.
He was born on Christmas Day?
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah, he was a Christmas baby, December 25th, 1924. Yeah. Yeah, so. And then, yeah, so he became a paratrooper, and he saw some pretty heavy combat in the Philippines. He was in the Pacific Theater, and he fought in Leyte and Luzon in the Philippines in some of the bloodiest battles, you know, of that theater. And he came back scarred by it. He came back. It changed him. That's for sure. It shaped him as a man and as a writer for the rest of his life. And he went back to the battlefield often in his work, in the Twilight Zone and out of the Twilight Zone. Some of his most powerful stuff is the war-related stuff. One particular episode, The Purple Testament, from the Twilight Zone, is set in Leyte. It's set during World War II in Leyte, and it's the one time where he actually transported, I mean, as biographical as he could get in the Twilight Zone. And some of the characters are actually named after his war buddies who died in those 30 days in Leyte. The famous, you know, the most famous story, you know, about his service, I think, is, you know, from other biographies. I didn't discover this, but other biographers has mentioned it. I go through it too. But you know, one of his friends. This is, you know, when they were in Leyte, what their primary mission was, there was a mountain range in the middle of Leyte. There's the Mayanog Mountains. It's this rugged mountain range that takes up most of the island. And their mission was to essentially get from one side of the island to the other, across these mountains. So they had to climb and just kill their way across the mountains because the Japanese had retreated to that mountain range. Other troops had already basically cleared the beaches, you know, they cleared the coasts, and they had retreated to the mountains. So when Serling and the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, about 2,000 men, got to Leyte, their mission was to just get through those mountains, kill everything you see, and get to the other side and meet up with the rest of the forces. The 7th Division was on the other side of the island. And, you know, Serling, yeah, and every guy that survived it, you know, it was 30 days of hell. That's what they call it. It took them basically 30 days. And this is a story I get into in the book, is that, you know, Serling later on, he wrote about it. He wrote about it, you know, believe it or not, in Good Housekeeping magazine, as strange as that may sound. But he wrote about it. He said it's a little story called My Most Memorable Christmas. And it's because they started that 30-day trip on Thanksgiving, basically. And they made it through the mountains, and on December 24th is when they finally broke through and got to the other side of the mountains. And the story he tells, yeah, and it's his birthday, yes, yes. So the story he tells is that he got through, and, you know, they're demolished. They're on, you know, they're lying by the side of the, you know, the trail, beaten, and they haven't eaten. You know, this is a whole, you know, the whole other story behind that. You know, they were starving. They were starving. They hadn't eaten, and they realized that they made it. They're alive, and they're gonna, you know, down maybe half a mile away, they're gonna finally be able to eat and sleep, and so they get up and they start to move out, and they're marching, and they stop dead. And a whisper comes down from the front of the line, and Serling says, well, anytime there was a whisper that was coming down from the front of the line and you're holding your breath and you're staying still, it means Japanese, it means a mined trail, there's a machine gun, you know, something that's a reminder that we're in a war still, you know. And he said, you know, so it's coming down like a game of telephone. It's coming down the line. He says, the guy in front of me turned to whispers, and he says, it's Christmas. So that's how he spent his 20th birthday. And you're realizing he's, you know, it's Christmas in Leyte. And he loved Christmas. You know, that was one of the things. He grew up, he had a childlike love for Christmas, and it came up a lot in his work. I mean, you probably know Night of the Meek from the Twilight Zone. A great episode. Art Carney was probably, between Art Carney and Jack Klugman, they were Serling's two favorite actors. No doubt about it.
One of the few that remade in the later one that still held up.
Yeah, Richard Mulligan?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty good, actually, yeah. Art Carney, yeah, and he loved Art Carney. He was in a couple of his shows before, Twilight Zone.
There was a Twilight Zone episode I remember most, I think, or one of the ones I remember most, about death, where this guy is walking along this path with his dog, and basically, you know, it's like, do you want to go this way, do you want to go that way? And it's like, no, any place that wouldn't accept my dog isn't heaven. And, you know, so he's trying to be tricked by the devil.
Right.
Yeah.
And thinking about another show, MASH, they did something similar to that with an officer who died, you know, in the MASH unit, and it was like his ghost, and it's like, what's it like? I didn't know what it would be like, you know, this way, and kind of wander off into the
I vaguely remember the MASH episode, actually.
Yeah.
I have to look that up.
But that ending was so Twilight Zone.
Yeah, the episode's called The Hunt, and it was actually written by Earl Hamner. Earl Hamner wrote that when he created the
White
Waltons.
played the little trickster demon guy trying to convince him he was St. George.
Yeah.
Oh, you go across the Elysian field.
He realizes he's dead, he's walking that path, and the guy tries to convince him to come in, but they won't take the dog. He says, well, screw that, I'm not going there, I'll go somewhere else. And it turns out that the angel comes and says, oh, good thing you didn't go in there, because, you know, they didn't want the dog in, because the dog would have told you where you were going. And, you know, you can't, so the devil,
you would have smelled that.
he says, man will walk right into hell with both eyes open, but even the devil can't fool the dog.